Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, it's a sci-fi versus episode with Dark City and the City of Lost Children. We haven't done one of these verses in a while, so this should be fun. But before we do that, just a couple calls to action this week. We want to thank loyal listener and now Patreon subscriber, Cthulhu Bob. Cthulhu Bob, who has been listening to the show for a long time, has become a subscriber over at patreon.com/GenreVision, and we wanted to say thank you so much. He left us a little message on our Patreon page, and man, if it didn't become the bright spot of my week.
Hell yeah, it made me glow from within. It felt very good. Cthulhu Bob now has access to a growing library of content that includes more currently consuming, uncut episodes of Fin Flicks, and then special episodes that we don't actually put up in the feed. Also up on our Patreon page for our subscribers is a preview of our next big video project. I put a short preview up today that shows some early footage from it. And then I have a video from a couple weeks ago that I posted of me actually doing some preliminary editing on the audio for that project, if you'd like to see that. That's all at patreon.com/GenreVision. It costs $5 a month to become a premium subscriber. And this gives you access to that library of audio content that is, I think, nearly 40 hours at this point, something like that.
It's a lot.
It's a lot of commutes. It's a lot of walks. If you listen to podcasts on your walks, it's some fun stuff.
Well, we've got two movies to discuss, so let's get into it. And we're going to start with Dark City, which actually came out after City of Lost Children. But Dark City has always, I felt, been this very niche, culty movie. It's often kind of lumped in with a lot of the sci-fi of the late 90s, a lot of which we've actually done on this show, like The Matrix, Existenz, The 13th Floor, these science fiction stories that were kind of questioning things about reality. Dark City, I know, was not very successful at all at the box office, but Roger Ebert was a big booster for it. I think he called it his favorite film of that year.
It was. And reviews at the time were mixed. I think a lot of people saw it and couldn't deny that the film just oozed with style and had lots of smart ideas and had a good cast and a good score and all this sort of stuff. And yeah, all that is true. But the theatrical cut of the film, as we know it today, is compromised, I think. And we'll get into that.
Well, for sure, because the opening of the theatrical cut features a voiceover from Kiefer Sutherland's character,
Dr. Schreiber.
Dr. Schreiber, which basically spells out what the movie is. And it tells you that there were these beings called strangers that abducted people, took them to this place, they put them to sleep every night at midnight, and they changed them around into different identities to try. They're basically experimenting on people to find out what it is that makes them human and what gives them what Schreiber calls a soul, because this is something that these alien beings known as strangers lack. And these strangers are these jellyfish things that live inside the brains of deceased humans and use them as vessels. And the thrust of the story is a character who we find out is called John Murdoch, who wakes up during one of these experiments and kind of figures out what's going on. And in the theatrical cut of the movie, we, as the audience, know what's going on because the voiceover tells us. And that was studio mandated voiceover that the producers felt that audiences would be a little too unwary about what was going on and letting the mystery unfold. They felt they needed to spell that out early on. And we'll get to that when we talk about the director's cut. But I don't know. I know maybe some people are going to go to bat for The Crow, but I think this is Alex Proyas's best film by a mile.
I would agree. Yeah, I think stylistically and conceptually, this is by far his best film. And The Crow is fun. You put Michael Wincott in that role and you give him a big enough pile of cocaine to snort, and the movie is going to be like watchable on some level. So,
sure.
Yeah, I can't hate on The Crow. But yeah, this is, I think, by a country mile, Proyas's best film. And he has a story credit on it and a screenplay credit on it. But the other writers with screenplay credits are Lem Dobbs and David Goyer, who you might remember as the writer of the Blade movies and the director of the third Blade movie. And he also worked on some big DC movies. He had some assists in the Chris Nolan Batman movies as well. And
yeah, directed The Invisible
with Justin Chatwin.
America's sweetheart.
Yes. So, yeah, David Goyer, fingers in a lot of pies with that guy. And it's probably one of David Goyer's best scripts too.
Oh, for sure. I mean, my assumption would be that Goyer, as is often his case, is that he is a fixer with scripts, that he is trying to make potentially more complicated stories, as far as genre stories, more palatable. And Dark City, for as weird as it gets, I think is pretty easy to follow as far as plot momentum is concerned, because we have a very defined protagonist in John Murdoch, played by Rufus Sewell. This mystery that he's trying to figure out in regards to he doesn't know who he is and what's going on with this city. That's easy enough to follow, even if everything else surrounding the movie were to come off as strange and unapproachable. I think the actual momentum of the plot, thanks to John Murdoch and how everything kind of unfolds, is easy enough to understand. I don't think you have to like it. I mean, I do, certainly, but I think it works on a very structural level in that regard.
The mystery is supposed to be compelling enough to suck people in. And clearly the studio felt at the time that the mystery was not compelling enough, and audiences, based on test screenings, may have felt distanced by the movie, because the movie is really strong stylistically. And if something like this comes off as artsy-fartsy in any sort of way, it's going to distance the audience a bit, who's there to expect a popcorn movie. This was a studio picture from New Line. So in an effort, I think, to make it more palatable, they decided to eliminate the mystery up front, which I think was a pretty stupid idea, at least from an artistic standpoint, and let the movie sort of run on briskness and style as the primary motivating factors.
Which it has in spades.
Yeah, it's stylish as a motherfucker. You get that immediately.
Well, and it's stylish. It's stylish in a way that we don't often see from studio pictures. The fact that this movie is so indebted to Art Deco and German Expressionism is so weird to me. And it's certainly not the only movies that have done that, but to do it as a big tentpole, I mean, this is New Line Cinema. This was kind of positioned to be a big blockbuster presentation for New Line.
And there's quite a bit of money on the screen. I mean, you look at the budget for it nowadays and it doesn't look like anything huge. I think, what was it, 45?
No, wait, yeah, that was your guess. I think it was somewhere in the realm of like 24 to 27.
My gosh. Hopefully that was cut back due to the shooting in Australia, because I do believe that most of the production for this happened in Australia. Hence why, Bruce Spence got cast in the thing.
Which great. Love seeing him.
They ended up selling some of the sets for this movie to the production of The Matrix, which also shot in Australia. So when it can't run on style, like when they pare the style back and do sort of simpler stuff where characters are just talking in rooms, of course the movie's still stylish in that point, but the edit on this flick is so ruthlessly tight. It has such a motivation to push and push and push. And I think they've pretty much compressed the movie to its limit in the theatrical cut, to the point where there's not a whole lot of connectivity between certain sequences, but there's just enough for you to kind of put two and two together as to why characters are showing up in certain spaces. Granted, there is a little bit of confusion in the director's cut as well, as to like how a character got to where they are in a particular scene or something like that. But you don't, in the director's cut, get that same sense of like uber tight compression.
Well, it's interesting because Christopher Nolan has specifically brought up Dark City in regards to his films Inception and Memento. And Memento, I think, is a movie that many people have seen and can relate back to Dark City. And the point I'm going to make is that Memento feels equally kind of breathless, but by chopping it up into these non-linear segments and playing with the structure of the story, it actually feels like it's breathing more.
Well, that you have the stuff in black and white where Guy Pearce is talking on the phone about Sammy Jankis or whatever it is.
Right. And if that played out more naturally, I think we might see something along the lines of Dark City's kind of propulsion. But even like you're saying, this was clearly edited to get to the big points, to not stick too long. Because there's moments when the movie breathes. They're usually very early on in setup moments. For example, when we meet Jennifer Connelly's character as a lounge singer. The movie has that, but it really wants to keep you going. I'm kind of okay with that because there's so much about this movie to me that sucks me in purely as a visual experience. I mean, and I don't just mean that it looks pretty. It's also production wise something that just blows me away. I mean, the miniatures in this movie are maybe some of the best I've ever seen.
They're incredible. The stuff in the opening, it really reminded me of, seeing Burton's Gotham for the first time and the sort of use of miniatures to create a cityscape that was both familiar and throwback and entirely new. It was just hit the right balance. And normally the kind of brevity that this movie exhibits is an absolute killer for mood and showcase. You know what I mean? Like, this somehow manages to be super brisk, but also be a really good showcase for its effects, especially the practical ones.
Oh, for sure. And I think that one of my biggest compliments to Proyas as a director for this is he is really good at making the spaces in the film feel beautiful, well-established, and surprisingly real. No matter how fantastical they get, I believe in the places the camera is showing me every time it takes me to something newer and crazier. And in the case of this movie, where the world is literally changing at the whim of the strangers, who have this ability called tuning, where they reshape the city every night and change it around as part of their experiment. That should read as absolutely false to me. It never does.
No, it's entirely dependent on the film sort of taking place in a vacuum. And sometimes
literally
these movies sort of taking place, in a vacuum sort of removes them from any sort of tangibility. But the whole point of this is that it takes place in a vacuum. It's an experiment that's sort of shut off. And the voiceover at the beginning of the theatrical cut doesn't say that the city itself is this sort of small space station. Ultimately, it basically says that the strangers came to Earth to solve their own mortality because the strangers are dying. And the big difference, like you said earlier, is that the strangers not only are alien beings, but they share a hive mind. They share a single consciousness, and then they act that out in these things that they deem to be individuals. You know, they call themselves Mr. Hand or Mr. Book or
no more Mr. Quick.
Yeah, Mr. Quick.
Yeah, all these things that are completely inhuman, as their names suggest. And there's so many things, performance-wise. Richard O'Brien gets to be kind of he's not the big bad of the movie. That would be Mr. Book, but he's kind of the most interesting, because at one point the strangers are trying to find John Murdoch and why it is he's waking up during their experiments and why he seems to have the ability to tune, which only the strangers have. And they figure the only way to find out where he's going is to implant his memories into Richard O'Brien's character, Mr. Hand. And so he is this weird combination of stranger and human, and this particular memories and personality that they put into Mr. Hand that they were intending to put into John Murdoch is that of somebody who is committing murders.
Right, a serial killer. So it comes to light that these strangers were reconfiguring John Murdoch in his sleep to be a serial killer. That experiment, for a reason unknown, failed, and John Murdoch woke up when he was supposed to be asleep. We see John Murdoch in the opening, when we have his introduction, he has a dot of blood on his forehead where Dr. Schraber's syringe would have gone in and injected this serial killer personality into him. But for whatever reason, in Murdoch, it doesn't take.
Right. And it's posited in the theatrical cut that possibly Murdoch has evolved, because we don't know how long the strangers have been performing this experiment. And eventually one person, Murdoch, evolved to be able to do what they do and to resist this experiment. In the director's cut, there is more kind of little hints at this idea.
Right. The fingerprints, he has odd fingerprints.
Yes, his fingerprints are perfect spirals. And that continues to get brought up to see. It's like, no, he is physically changed because of what we've been doing. So this does eventually become it's so weird to me, the finale of this movie, in which it becomes a Dragon Ball Z fight.
Yeah.
Like it reminds me so much of Matrix Revolutions. But instead it's kind of my favorite thing, where it is just, people are using psychic powers. So they're flying around a super stylistic, dark, wet city and giving each other stare downs while CG waves shoot out of their faces and they knock each other around. It definitely is weird for the movie we've been watching, but it's not totally out of place. There's we mentioned this when we were talking before it off mic, where the strangers are able to levitate throughout the city, and there are some awesome shots of them just floating through the city.
Sure. And it's stuff like that I think eventually allows this pretty straight-faced movie to go to a fairly goofy place in the climax, and for it to not feel like a total riot.
It earns it. Like, it's still wacky and weird, but it's not unearned.
Right. Yeah, it feels good. And I think one of the things that helps goofy moments sort of fit in with the rest of the movie or feel appropriate for that movie is the score by Trevor Jones. Score for this movie is real good, y'all.
Oh, it's so it's so bombastic and big and really gorgeous. It's a really good score.
Well, it sort of fits the landscape of the city, and it establishes such a tone and a mood. Something I was trying to get at earlier is that when movies have this sort of super pushy motivation to move and move and move to the next scene and keep going, that can kill mood and just so quickly. I mean, I remember this clip of David Lynch having arguments with Showtime executives about his shooting schedules on Twin Peaks. He's like, it doesn't give us any fucking time to get dreamy.
Yeah.
That's not the problem here. Like, this still feels suitably moody. Even though they don't really stay certain places for very long, and you don't have characters sitting around and having really moody conversations for extended periods of time, the movie just wants to go, go, go. But it's not an action film. I mean, there are certainly action sequences in it, and they're exciting.
It's a noir film hiding inside of a sci-fi film. And within that sci-fi film, there's really interesting ideas coming out. I mean, I think one of the biggest one is what constitutes identity. What does it mean? Are our memories the only things that make us who we are?
Right. Well, the movie basically outright says that humans have a soul. Humans have a self that is disconnected from memory and body, something that is eternal, that lasts within us. There's pretty obvious Buddhist parallels here. These characters are all sort of in a cycle of suffering, which, Buddhists believe life is suffering, and you are reincarnated. You put back in the cycle, and then when you exit the cycle of suffering, you achieve or attain nirvana. So, as these people are sort of endlessly recycled into new identities, the movie posits that they retain a immutable self somewhere deep down.
Right. Yeah. And that's why no matter what roles we see these people changing and shifting into throughout the movie, when the strangers give them new identities, there's things that peek out that are undeniably them.
Like the hotel desk clerk.
Right. Exactly.
He gets repurposed into a newspaper stand later on, and he says, if there's some sort of specific turn of phrase he has, I forget what he says, but not only do we recognize the actor, but we think, oh man, there's something that's in that guy still that makes him the same person.
Yeah, it's definably him.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is before we start to switch gears here. I haven't seen this read on the film anywhere, and I do not believe it's intentional at all. But I also took away the idea of this is a film talking about creation, and specifically as it refers to art, in this idea that the strangers are kind of this, machine or this hive mind of people that are trying to create stories out of humans with no understanding of why they work or what makes them special. That you could read strangers as kind of if you want to boil it down to just Hollywood, like they're the producers, they're the money men, they're the people that make the sets happen and everything.
They're trying to engineer reality. Yeah.
Right. And within that, they will find someone, a John Murdoch, who is an artist, like who is somebody who can create like they can, but is not bound by their rules or their hive mind thinking. Right.
And I think this is reinforced, this sort of particular read is reinforced by what he does at the end of the film, which is, he gives Dark City a day-night cycle. He manages to turn it towards sunlight for the first time in however long it's been. He gives it a sea and beaches. And this whole thing, he's trying to chase, and this motivation for him is he's trying to get to this place called Shell Beach. Turns out it never existed. It's just this false memory that they've implanted in everybody, but it's a very vague false memory. They all know that Shell Beach is a thing somewhere, but they can never quite remember how to get there. And, Murdoch uses this as one of his motivations. Once he finds out it's a lie, he then can make it for himself.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much about Dark City, I think, as a technical experiment and in filmmaking, as a stylistic experiment. I think it's a total winner. I think we can, when we throw it in the Thunderdome, we can kind of pick it apart a little bit. And I'll especially bring up the director's cut.
Yeah. Is there anything about Dark City you think hasn't aged terribly well?
Well, I mean, I wrote down at some point in the movie that I felt that the effects were never unsightly or distracting to me. The Dragon Ball Z fight at the end has some stuff. Like earlier in the movie, we see one of the strangers' heads gets chopped open and we see the actual alien crawl out. That looks pretty good.
I beg to differ. The theatrical cut, the CGI on that is a little PlayStation 2.
I thought it looked okay. It's later when we get zoom ins to the actual creatures inside and we see their mouths and stuff. It's like, yeah, that looks really digital.
Yeah, it's not a really well-developed creature or a really well-conceived creature on screen. It's not a creature movie, so I guess that's forgivable in a sense, but that's the one effect I think that really doesn't hold up at all in any sense of the word. I also think that Jennifer Connelly's performance is not quite what the movie needs. Like, she's certainly not bad in the movie, but I don't really believe her as the jazz singer, and it's a combination of like her voice, which I just don't think, it's not bad, but I don't quite think it's suited for what she is in the movie. She doesn't get to share the screen a whole lot with Rufus Sewell in the movie because they're on their different quests in the film, but I don't think they have great chemistry.
Well, I said to you that having Jennifer Connelly and William Hurt in your movie and then having them share scenes together is a pretty confident doubling down on understated acting.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of thing you have to be prepared for. Like, because I love William Hurt, but
sure,
it is very easy not to like William Hurt's style of acting.
It can be pretty subdued. I think he's pretty good in the movie as this sort of tired cop who plays everything very close to the chest and sort of everything by the book. His sort of contrast character in that sense is this cop Walensky, who, like John Murdoch, has somehow awakened to the truth that the strangers are changing the city. How he has managed to evade them is not really elucidated in the film, but he's become this sort of whacked out conspiracy theorist who, draws spirals on his walls and all this theorist stuff.
He's a cliche away from a red yarn map.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm glad they didn't do the freaking red yarn web on the wall. No, but he's basically that character.
They had a unique visual language and style to play with more to get across the same idea. But no, they didn't have to fall victim to that. But
yeah, I found Kiefer Sutherland's performance was not bad, but it took a little bit of getting used to because it's some pretty strong choices from him.
I mean, if we want to go out talking about performances, this is bold casting across like Rufus Sewell is your lead. Like, that's a choice.
It is a choice, and he's a good lead.
He's a very good lead. I think he's very good, but he is not who a typical Hollywood movie would cast in that role.
No, not at all. And the movie's better for it.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons the movie works and why it has its unique flavor. But he's a weird guy to have in that role. But he absolutely nails it. Like, I think he's incredibly compelling and takes a character that, again, I mean, even Rufus Sewell at times, a lot of the movie is playing things understated. But he's just really good. It's a movie that I think that's something, you know, the performances, the casting might not click with some people. It does for me. I didn't even have a problem with Jennifer Connelly, but I do think that's something that people should be aware of if they haven't seen the movie before. That is something you have to get on that wavelength as far as the performances go. But then you also have, I adore Richard O'Brien in this movie going full. I mean, he is basically Max Schreck and, you know, Count Orlok style in this.
Yes. Yeah. The full Count Orlok sort of stuff is really compelling from him.
He's such a good villain. And when he just gets to, in that whisper voice of his, do lines, I'm like, this is such a good villain.
So again, it earns its goofery, you know, when they say let the tuning commence. Yeah, I wanted to roll my eyes, but I was also really loving the whole imagery of the stranger hive mind and the sort of buildings twisting and growing up like organic shapes and then eventually sort of hardening into rigid shapes and sort of almost inflating out of the ground. The city not having any real discernible skyline because, you know, buildings can sort of move around at will.
Well, they use that for good action.
That moment where John Murdoch is climbing the staircase and they start the tuning and the staircase extends under his feet, or you get to witness that moment where the strangers are sort of retuning the world and they're retuning like a middle-class family's dining room into an upper-class family's dining room, and they're giving them all new identities. Like, the effects in that sequence for friggin' 1998, top notch, man. Shit looked so good.
It's good. It's really good. And like I said, they use that for effective action when the strangers are chasing John Murdoch during the tuning, and he's got to grab on to a chimney that's growing up from the ground, and a stranger gets crushed between two buildings.
Yeah.
It's like, this is that. It's great taking that idea and being like, yeah, we can play that for action.
I love, you know, this is what I love about movies like this that use such tangible things and, you know, places to set their movie among objects instead of out in vast open fields or plains or voids.
No void space in Dark City.
Yeah, there is no void space. It's very tightly packed. It's a very dense feeling movie, you know, both narratively and spatially. So yeah, I appreciate that sort of compactness. I find it a fairly easy movie to watch. It doesn't ever get too twisted. There are some really, really big moments of darkness. You know, you get to see that the one little boy stranger doing some of the killing stuff. Like, it's really creepy.
It's good. Yeah, we'll kind of get around, I think, to final summations when we get in the verses, but let's switch gears here and talk about The City of Lost Children, which came out in 1995. This is directed by Jean-Pierre Jeunet, which I think most people will know from the film Amélie.
Yeah, well, the directing credits, before we go any further, the directing credits are a little weird on this.
Sure. Well, this is when Jeunet and his partner, Marc Caro, were kind of a package deal.
Right. And because this is not a Hollywood picture, and they were not DGA members at the time, they didn't have to credit one of them as director or, you know, or both as co-directors or what have you. Instead, the way that it's credited in the credits and when you went to the opening credits of the movie is Marc Caro is the artistic director, and Jean-Pierre Jeunet is listed as mise en scène. And then they say it's a Jeunet and Caro film. So yes, they share directing duties, but they decided to split it up for whatever reason. It's more than likely quite arbitrary, as artistic director and then mise en scène.
Well, and also, again, but for a little bit of backstory, they really were a duo, an artistic filmmaking duo, up until Junet got the job to do Alien Resurrection. Mm-hmm. And Caro was a part of that in the early stages, and they ended up having disagreements, and that actually kind of ended their professional relationship working as a duo. And from then on, I believe Junet has singular directing credits on all his movies. But The City of Lost Children, that this was kind of this is a weird movie for me, because I remember there was a preview for it or something on a VHS I owned or rented a whole bunch, and it was just images and music, no dialogue or anything. And I had not revisited it since I originally saw it, which probably was around like 99 or something, 2000. And City of Lost Children is a very different movie than Dark City. We picked this because it's like, okay, crazy, very bold sci-fi visions of some kind of fantasy world. City of Lost Children, while it has all of that, is not the same kind of movie as Dark City. Like I said, Dark City really is kind of a noir that then becomes a more clearly defined science fiction film. And City of Lost Children is a straight up fairy tale.
Yes, it is much more fantasy. Now, their settings are undeniably similar. They both feel kind of soundstage bound. They both use some really astounding effects to build these sort of false cities that seem to exist in a vacuum. These don't feel like real places, and they're not supposed to. Again, there's sort of a similarity to Burton's Batman in that this feels sort of like a Gotham, someplace that's sort of removed from what we know to be the contemporary world. There is a sense in City of Lost Children, just like in Dark City, of perpetual night. Even if there may be some, daytime scenes in City of Lost Children, they are few and far between. I think some of the scenes that maybe take place out on the water later on in the film are technically daytime, but it's an extraordinarily dimly lit film otherwise.
Well, you say dimly lit, but it's not, it's not like Solo, a Star Wars story, dimly lit. This is way more aware of its lighting and palette choices in a way, for me, that is striking in a way I don't think any other film is. Like, there's no other film that I can point to that's like, that looks exactly like City of Lost Children.
Well, I think Alien Resurrection is going to be the closest, actually. Same DP, it's Darius Kanji. He also shot Delicatessen, and he also shot Seven, oddly enough. But the technique that Darius Kanji uses is designed to give really, really deep blacks. So there is a point at which the shadows in the image fall off to like pure straight black. And so you get a super rich, contrasty image that doesn't appear overly dark, but the shadows look really, really deep. He has utilized that technique in, I know, Alien Resurrection and in City of Lost Children, possibly Delicatessen as well. And I think it was an optical process that they did. But it really lends a unique look to this. And the design, I think a lot of the sets, particularly in the sort of laboratory spaces that we see in City of Lost Children, are very reminiscent of Alien Resurrection.
Well, it's also in his lens. He likes to use a lot of wide-angle lenses, so you get that barrel distortion, especially with close-ups and everything. But the basic, this is a one where the story might sound a little complicated, but it has this fairy tale idea of that there is a scientist on this island that is kidnapping children from this mainland city and placing them in these basically like sarcophaguses and strapping them into this machine that he is using while he sleeps because he is incapable of dreaming. He is an experiment created by this scientist to, be a perfect person, but he didn't turn out well. And I love that we get all of this told to us to told to us by a brain in a jar.
It's a brain in a fish tank.
A brain in a jar is just, it's like, that's a thing, like Donovan's Brain.
Sure.
And
yeah.
All those kind of movies. But this brain in a fish tank very early on tells us the backstory of these characters, that they are all inventions of this scientist, but everyone kind of never worked out, that they all were wrong in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And the main antagonist, Crank, his defect is that he is incapable of having dreams. So he's kidnapping these children, but the children are afraid, so all of his dreams are nightmares. And he's not able to find a child that is giving him good dreams.
Also, his inability rather, to dream causes him to age prematurely. So we're not quite sure how old he is, but he's played by this guy who is probably a little over middle-aged at the time and bald as an egg.
Very much so. But a big part of the real thrust of the story centers around these characters, One and Miet. One is played by Ron Perlman, which I think this is one of my favorite Ron Perlman performances, and he's speaking in French in a non-native language to him.
Yeah, his accent's not very good.
It's not, but he's also being asked to play kind of a lumbering simpleton character. He talks with broken syntax.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't seem like he's fluent in French. The character doesn't seem like he's fluent in French at all. And, they don't ever get into like mental disability with him. It's certainly implied, but they don't really go there. It's more of
he's a child. Like,
yeah,
he's a child in a man's body.
Yeah. They want to make him basically a big, strong child. And he sort of falls in with a crew of children. He is basically a member of a freak show. And in the first act of the movie, One is performing in his freak show, and his, the sort of master of the freak show gets murdered right in front of him. And so he has this, income and this sort of lifestyle fall apart right in front of his eyes. And he has this kid that hangs out with him that he calls little brother, or Don Ray. And that night, after his sort of boss is killed, these bald men with mechanical eyes come looking for Don Ray, and they take him.
And it's revealed that this is a cult called the Church of the Cyclops or something.
Yep.
And they are basically being employed by the scientist on his island to kidnap these children and bring them to him. And then the story is One who teams up with Miet, who is this little girl that's part of this kind of band of orphans that are used to steal stuff for this pair of conjoined twins called the Octopus.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Played by these two actresses who do such an incredible job of synchronizing their performance. And even when they're talking separately, sort of back and forth at one another, the rhythm at which they have to do that and finish one another's sentences is like nothing short of astounding. It's an incredible compound performance. It's so good. Well,
doubly so because it's being done in a language I'm not fluent with, and it still reads perfectly.
Oh yeah. It's pretty wonderful. So you have this band of orphans who are being trained as like pickpockets by this really nasty pair of conjoined twins. They enlist One to help steal a safe, and he thinks that they might be able to help him locate his little brother, Don Ray. I don't know if it's actually his little brother. I don't think that is ever elucidated, but it really doesn't matter. It's just that One cares for this kid.
Mm-hmm. And so eventually that is the adventure of the movie, that they're going to end up finding out where are the children being taken, who's taking them, why are they taking them, this kind of stuff. This is a movie where I'm surprised the plot mechanics of it play out very storybook. So they're, as weird as the movie is conceptually, it's very, very easy to take in my opinion, because this was a movie that's being spoken in a language that I'm not fluent with. But I still understand what's going on simply. Now, granted, because this is a fairy tale, this movie is allowed to do kind of whatever it wants.
Sure.
And maybe that's a tough buy-in for some people, but for me, that's the magic of fantasy and fable. For example, there is a character who ran the circus, which the octopus was a part of, and he has basically fleas that he can send to inject people with some kind of chemical that when he plays his organ grinder, they will become mindless, murderous zombies for him. We have no explanation as to how this works. We just see it happen, and we're expected to believe it. And I love it. It's one of my favorite ideas in the movie.
Right. It just presents these wacky ideas as this all takes place in a world where things like this are somehow possible. You've got to buy into it. And I don't think it's a particularly steep buy-in. I think the steeper buy-in is that the movie never stops to explain itself, ever. And it doesn't give a whole lot of expository hand-holding. So I think there were some complaints. I think even Roger Ebert said he had trouble following the plot, which, you know, on one level, I don't blame him. But really, the movie's plot is told in broad enough strokes, and you know, the weirder aspects of it are explained, like, you know, the brain in the fish tank, Uncle Irvin, you know, he actually explains pretty directly what's going on, but he doesn't do so in a way that tells it plainly to the audience. He actually frames it as a bedtime story. One time, this mad scientist did this and that and this and that. And we know as the audience that he's, you know, offering exposition. But, you know, putting it inside that framing device of, I'm going to tell these characters a story. That's pretty interesting. Really, though, once the orphans show up, the band of like orphan thieves show up, there's one character who carries the movie that we haven't talked about, and that is Miette, played by this little girl named Judith Vitette, or Vitae. And she's like awesome in the movie. She reminds me so much of the girl from Let the Right One In.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I can see that. I mean, I definitely, Miette as a character, and she even states this outright to the group of kid thieves. They at one point say that, oh, this one person, he's like a child. Like he doesn't act like a grown up should. He acts like a child. And she turns to the kids and says, well, maybe you act more like grown ups than you should. Like that you're not, that this world that you've grown up in has hardened you so much that you can't be a child. But at the same time, Miette is a victim of that. She is incredibly stern, incredibly determined. At one point, her and one are going to be killed in this wonderfully elaborate setup where they're standing on planks, and on the other end balancing them are just baskets full of fish, which birds are coming and eating, and as they eat the fish slowly, they're going to get dunked and sink in the water. And she's very like resigned, like, all right, like if this is how I have to die, then fine, like I'm okay with it. It's a really, really strong performance for any actor, but especially from a child actor.
Sure. And I don't want to say that she carries the film, because I think that puts a little too much, you know, on the weight of any performer, or on the shoulders of any performer. But she does a hell of a job sort of being the adult in the film, because like all the other adults are acting pretty crazy. Like the guy, Marcello, the dude with the fleas, he's some like whacked out opium addict. One is just a giant child, basically. The octopus is this horrible monster. And then you have on the oil rig where the scientist Kronk is doing his experiments, you've got Kronk, who is this super weirdo. We're not quite sure how old he is. We have this character, this dwarf woman who has one of the most incredible, iconic looks in the movie.
Oh my gosh, she's so striking.
Yeah, and then you have Dominique Pinon, who you might recognize as Reese from Alien Resurrection, playing, was it 6 clones on the oil rig?
Something like that.
Oh my God. Some of the shots they pull off with multiple versions of him in the same shot, it's like, I know how they must have done that, but god damn is it seamless.
I have to bring that up. Even now, you know, almost 25 years later, this is some of the best of that, of shooting an actor in multiple places and never seeing the seams. Like maybe there's 1 or 2 shots that I didn't clock right away, but for the most part, when there's 3 or 4 versions of him in a scene, sometimes physically interacting with each other, it's amazing.
Yeah, and you know, like when the shot is wide enough, they can use doubles, and that's easy enough. But, you know, when 3 of them are sitting at a table and you have sort of a high angle down at the table, and, you know, things like their hands are overlapping or they're passing things to one another at the table, it's like, damn, that's really, really tough.
Well, to match the lighting and everything.
Make sure there aren't any shadows that fall in weird places and things like that. Like, yeah, it's
right.
It's a big deal. And the way that they do that one big panning shot right when they're first introducing all the clones, like that's another really, really standout moment. But I was really on board with this film. I, like you, did not take many notes on this film. And that's because the first scene of the movie struck me so hard that I was like, I just need to watch this and stop typing. The first scene of the movie opens up on a shot of a snowman seen through a window. It's snowing outside. The camera pulls back and we see this little kid in this sort of front room in this Christmas situation. And then a rope falls down the chimney and Santa Claus comes down. And it's so subtly creepy. And then a fucking second Santa Claus comes down the chimney and it's like, what the fuck is going on? And then Janae and Caro, for whatever reason, decided to do like a mushroom trip effect where everything is wavy and sort of undulating, and it's so unsettling. I couldn't believe how effective a scene it was.
And by the end of that scene, it's the entire room is filled with Santas.
Yeah. And the kid is like screaming and crying for real. Like, it's a really freaky, disturbing scene. Well,
the idea, like when it's setting up this classical idea that we have of, okay, Santa's coming down the chimney. The moment a second Santa comes in, it feels perverted.
Yes. And like one Santa is drinking out of a flask. Like you said, they have this like boozy Santa. It's like, where is all this coming from? And really it's the kid having the nightmare. Mm-hmm. And we find out later that Kronk dresses up as Santa Claus, or as the French call him, Papa Noel. He dresses up as Santa Claus and basically fucking antagonizes the kids in their cribs, thinking, he's trying desperately to make them happy so that he will get happy dreams from them.
Right. And it's Donray who is the only kid who's not afraid of him.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why he's the perfect subject, and that he'll be able to steal this kid's dreams. And by doing this, basically, he will steal his youth. Mm-hmm. That's the side effect of this process working. And by the end, Miette has decided, okay, I will take Donray's place because I'm not afraid of you either. And you let him go. This sequence where the climax is taking place in a dream, mm-hmm. which is so cool. And basically Miette is aging up while Kronk is aging down. There are some morphs in this scene.
Seamless.
It took me a few seconds to be like, that's a different actor all of a sudden.
Uh-huh. Yeah, when they morph from one actress to another, like particularly as Miette gets into like the senior citizen version of herself, that morph is so good. This is an absolute effects masterpiece, I think. There is some of the CGI that doesn't quite hold up, like the little fleas and stuff like that. But you know what?
It's stylish enough. Like
sure.
It fits in the stylistic tone of the movie that it never pulled me out of the spell that this movie cast on me.
Agreed. Totally agreed. And even, there are practical elements that they use in the flea scenes. Like there's one scene where the camera is hopping around like a flea. So it does these really, really fast, I think it was probably motion controlled jumps, mm-hmm. or there were CGI camera moves. I mean, it's really, really cool. Some of the tricks and gags that they pull with the camera in this flick.
And you'll see, especially in Delicatessen, this carries through to City of Lost Children, where Caro and Jeunet really love this kind of Rube, and it's an Amelie too, this kind of Rube Goldbergian view of the world, where they mm-hmm. kind of see how different things affect other things. Like, for example, in Lost Children, there's a sequence where we're kind of following a dog around, and then it meets another dog, and they cut to a comedic shot of them, having sex, and then cut to the dog that was getting humped. We're now following that dog. Like, yeah. it's this wonderful rhythm of comedy that feels like a Rube Goldberg machine of like, where is this going? This one seemingly small thing sets off this sequence of events that eventually is going to lead us to an important point.
Right. That happens a couple times in the movie. Like there's a scene where I think Miette is in danger and there's something happens where there's flooding that sends water down into the sewers, and that eventually sort of I think helps her get out of trouble. There's a series of shots that like you see water gushing down into the sewers, but it's like blocked up with rats, and then you see the rats sort of wash out of the sewers. And as you can tell, like our praise is pretty effusive with this. We're really into it.
Well, then I think it's time to go to the Thunderdome and put Dark City and City of Lost Children up against each other. And I'm going to start things off because we do have to, as we've mentioned, talk about the director's cut of Dark City. I watched both versions for this episode. I had not seen the director's cut before. And the director's cut is kind of a great example of a director's cut because there's only about 10 or 11 minutes of footage that was added in. The majority of changes are taking out the voiceover in the opening and not showing us the city being put to sleep in the opening and excising that and putting it later in the movie, kind of at the beginning of the second act, allows us to follow John Murdoch and discover the mystery along with him in a way more organic fashion. There's other smaller things, but this is a case where I think the director's cut is absolutely the version that you should see of Dark City. They've done some other things, like they've futzed with the effects a bit, and it does look better.
And they've changed the color grading quite a bit, I believe.
They did. The theatrical version, the DVD that was out originally had a totally different color grade, but the most recent releases of Dark City, which include the director's cut and theatrical cut, have the same color grading.
Gotcha. Okay.
So here's the thing. If we're putting the theatrical cut of Dark City up against Lost Children, I have to give it to Lost Children. You know, those compromises to Dark City do affect it in enough significant ways, especially when you see once those changes are taken out. If I was to put the director's cut of Dark City up against City of Lost Children, Dark City, as weird as it is actually really accessible, I think.
Agreed. Yeah.
I think it has an easier in for people, especially if you watch the director's cut and enjoy the mystery with John Murdoch and kind of let it play out naturally. And I think the way it presents its ideas in the director's cut makes sense and are fascinating and intriguing and unique and incredibly arresting. But man, City of Lost Children really was like magic. And I know that's a really hackneyed thing to say, but it was the same way where it's like, I didn't take any notes because I was enraptured by the movie. It was I think I said to you at one point, I sent you a message where I was like, City of Lost Children is one of those movies where any shot in this movie would be the best shot in any other movie.
And you're completely right. This is one of the best shot movies in terms of like fantasy, like pure fantasy, that I've seen in quite a while. And even Dark City gave it a run for its money. Like Dark City was shot by the other Dariush Wolski, who's the guy who shot Prometheus and has worked actually on a bunch of Ridley Scott stuff. I also believe he shot Sweeney Todd, oddly enough. But this was a really good matchup. But like you said, theatrical cut to theatrical cut, City of Lost Children clearly has the advantage. If you wanted to go more, director's cut of Dark City to City of Lost Children, I don't think I could declare a winner in that matchup. I think the two are pretty evenly matched.
I told you that I think this week we have two masterpieces, and as you rightly said, the M word is a big deal. But when I say masterpiece, I mean it kind of in the most analytical definition, and that it is the best work of an artist's canon. And like I said, this is Alex Proyas's best work. I really strongly believe that. And I think City of Lost Children, it's Genet and potentially Genet and Carreau's masterwork. It's something else. Like, I've never seen another movie quite like it. When we get to the shelf picks, we can discuss that. But it is just so gorgeous to look at. I think conceptually it's so much weirder than Dark City, and that's a difficult buy-in. But the simplicity of how it tells its story and that fairy tale nature of it makes it something that's like, I think smart enough kids could watch this.
Sure, yeah. And it's really supposed to function on that sort of level where you trust, you place a certain amount of trust in the way the story is told, and you're not questioning every move it takes. Because when you're telling a kid a story like that, they don't tend to get hung up on the same things that adults do. They sort of go along with the flow, and that sort of fairy tale sense of this happens, then this happens, doesn't really bother them like it bothers us. So the fact that the story isn't giving you every single little piece that you might need in a Hollywood film is, I think, something that works to the film's advantage. It makes it almost sort of an all ages film, despite it being fairly disturbing and sometimes a little violent.
It's dark and violent, but in the way that a Grimm's fairy tale is.
Sure.
And so in that, I think by the slightest of edges, I have to give it to City of Lost Children. You can't go wrong with watching either of these. I think both of these are necessary viewing. Yeah,
no kidding. If you're looking for one to laugh along to, watch City of Lost Children because it's way funnier. Dominique Pinon is like full clown mode in this movie. He's the big comic relief, and even Kronk is pretty funny. He's got some pretty
Ron
insane
Perlman's
moments.
Funny. Yeah, he is. The entire thing where he thinks Miette is dead and he's getting drunk.
Okay, yeah, that is pretty funny. Yeah,
I think there's a lot. The gag of him giving her a string from his sweater to use as kind of like a tied line, and just seeing the sweater get more and more unraveled, and he keeps wearing it. It's a fun movie. It's funny. It's weirder. Like, its surface is weirder. Dark City, the surface, its weirdness exposes itself, and I think it's easier to kind of step it through the door of Dark City, but it's just as weird eventually as I think City of Lost Children is. I think this is one of the best versus double features we've ever done.
I mean, it's certainly been, among the most evenly matched and one of the most fun to watch. Like, sometimes in versus, there's a pretty clear winner, but here it's definitely been fun to discuss the merits of both. And I think we've picked, now that we've not done a whole lot of picking at the cinema, we've picked some really, really fun things to talk about this year. Anyway, if you wanted to pick something that reminds you of Dark City or City of Lost Children, or, that you think would pair well with either of those films, you would go to The Shelf. We would like to hear your shelf picks, audience. Or actually, I'm going to talk to you, listener. Yeah, the one and only you. If you have a shelf pick, if you have a movie that you want to pull off the shelf that you think would pair well with these, please put it in the comments section on our website, GenreVision.com. That would really make our day. Anyway, Drew, do you have a shelf pick?
Well, I think both Dark City and City of Lost Children owe a particular debt to one specific filmmaker, and that is Terry Gilliam.
Yes. Oh my gosh. The stuff, what is it? The meaning of life that he has, the buildings moving around.
Oh, yeah. The Crimson Permanent Assurance.
Oh my God. That reminded me a lot of Dark City.
That's a good one. I mean, that's not what I'm pulling, but that is the Crimson Permanent Assurance is so good.
It is.
It's beautiful too. It's an absolutely beautiful short film. But no, if you're going to pick one big landmark Terry Gilliam film that also has multiple cuts like Dark City, we're talking Brazil.
Yeah, this is one of those...
Also Creepy Santa.
Yeah, it does have Creepy Santa. It's kind of like a stealth Christmas movie. Yeah, Brazil's really great.
It's tough, though. It's a tough...
Yeah.
Well, because here's the thing. Like I say, there's two cuts. There was one that was very hacked to pieces by the studio to deliver a happy ending and be as commercial a movie as you could make from Brazil.
Yeah.
But the intended director's cut, which is the version you should see, it's longer, significantly longer. It's got the same kind of fabricated world. Like, it doesn't really exist in a place we know as reality. And it's got a lot of that same kind of visual flair that both of these movies have. And it has a dark edge, as do both Dark City and City of Lost Children. But it's a tough watch, not just because of the subject matter and where the story eventually goes, but it's a big, bold, weird film in every sense. And
sure.
And when you're being that big, bold, and weird, not everything's going to hit for everybody.
No, and you know what's interesting is that I don't know a single woman that likes this movie.
I mean, that's a good point. Because this is a movie that is reducing its female character to a goddess on a pedestal type.
Or the horrible mother.
Yes. That's for sure. I mean, we can debate the wokeness of Terry Gilliam on another episode, because
it's not just wokeness, but I do think the film has a really aggressively masculine perspective informs how it works, and it's a deep satire too, which Dark City and City of Lost Children, neither of those films has a satirical bone in its body.
No.
If I had to pick a Gilliam movie, I probably would have picked 13 Monkeys.
12 Monkeys.
12 Monkeys, but
that was my other one I was considering.
The big eye moving around on the TV thing, what is it, when it's instructing Bruce Willis what to do?
I just haven't seen 12 Monkeys in a long time, so it's not as fresh in my mind. Brazil is a movie that it's such I think, an incredible landmark in being like nobody else could make that movie. It's a movie that could never be made again. Mm-hmm. And I think in terms of building a world and blending different styles of fairy tale, sci-fi, all this kind of stuff, Brazil does it all. But like I said, Brazil is by no means, it's not even my favorite Gilliam movie by a long shot. But I think it's one that Dark City and City of Lost Children are pulling from consciously or subconsciously.
It definitely sort of belongs in a similar category. If I had to pull something off the shelf, I'm going to pull something off with a lot less substance, actually. It is a movie called Beyond the Black Rainbow, directed by Panos Cosmatos, the director of Mandy. If you want a movie where a bald, creepy scientist chases around a kid in the creepy laboratory, and it's about the kid trying to escape the clutches of the creepy bald scientist, and it's atmospheric and it's dark, like you should see Beyond the Black Rainbow. It's not a very substantive movie. It is a movie that is more about setting and mood and style and sound. It's not a densely plotted movie. It's even less substantial than Mandy in that department. And there are fewer characters that you can invest in. But I think the most interesting character by far is the scientist character in the film. There is a sequence where you get some of his backstory and sort of what he went through to become the person he is. Mm-hmm. And it is just fascinating.
Yeah, I would say Beyond the Black Rainbow, I mean, Mandy is on a whole nother level, but Beyond the Black Rainbow, it's a great statement movie for what Panos Cosmatos wants to do with film. He wants to create dreams, really psychedelic, colorful, kind of music video dreams.
Right. And this is like on the total opposite end of the briskness spectrum, whereas like Dark City has all the briskness. This has none of it. It's basically all mood. It wants you to sit and marinate in every moment.
I mean, it's. I would not recommend taking any substances and watching Beyond the Black Rainbow.
You don't need them.
You don't need them at all, but it's replicating that kind of feeling. Mm-hmm. Like it feels like a trip of a movie, and not in a like, whoa, cool, man, that kind of way. It's like, no, we're just going to sit here and kind of hum for an hour and a half. You know what I mean? like that kind of feeling. So, but no, yeah, I think that's definitely one that I hope a movie that people are reevaluating and going back to after Mandy. Because
I think it's a deeper cut than any other movie we've talked about today.
Maybe. It was one I was very excited for the lead up to. And
if only as a stylistic exercise.
Yeah, it's just, it's a distinct creative visual voice that you see in Beyond the Black Rainbow, and which you absolutely see in both Dark City and City of Lost Children.
All right. Does that put us in currently consuming territory?
It does. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
I finally got the chance to see Booksmart, the comedy directed by Olivia Wilde, that was released by Annapurna in theaters earlier this year. I slept on it in theaters for whatever reason. I can't remember exactly why. I just didn't get the chance to go see it. But I slept on it, and holy shit, is this movie good. I had probably one of the best times watching a studio comedy, even though it's, kind of a smaller film. Like, this is by all sort of means, in writing and in tone, in line with most studio comedies, in that it is raunchy, it's about teens and parties and things like that, and it's telling the kind of jokes that you might expect to see in a studio comedy, but it's doing it with such wit and style. I'm more than impressed. I'm absolutely in love with this movie. I think it's one of the best movies I've seen so far this year. You're definitely going to hear about it at the end of the year when I talk about my top 15 films of 2019. But I love this. I was head over heels for it.
Yeah, it'll come up again by the end of the year, I think, for both of us in one way or another. Like I said when I talked about it on the show, I think one of its most valuable things is perspective, and I don't mean that from a political socio-political standpoint of like, yeah, it's got to be women voices and stuff. I agree with that sentiment, but what I really like about Booksmart is that, yeah, again, like we said with Panos Cosmatos or anything, it feels like it's coming from a perspective that we are not really seeing specifically in this kind of genre of studio comedy.
Yes, we got a little bit of it with Blockers last year.
A little bit, but even so, one of the biggest takeaways I had from Booksmart was, hey, I'm keeping my eye on Olivia Wilde as a director because this looks way better than most studio comedies ever look.
Yeah, it's real stylish, and it has
it's
mood.
Rich. It's a rich palette too. Like the movie does not ever look flat or bland
or cheap.
No, not at all. So great performances, great stuff, all that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at the end of the year. But yeah, I'm very excited you got around to seeing it. And that, I mean, you told me I think you watched it like basically twice in a row.
I didn't watch it all the way through the second time because I had to get up and do something. I had to go to work or something.
But you were like, I want to watch this again, like immediately.
Yeah, it was that good. I felt the urge to watch it again the next night. It was I was really impressed with it. This is like a huge star-making performance, I think, from Beanie Feldstein, who has been great in plenty of other things, but I think totally owns this movie. She's so funny in it.
That's great. It's if just a showcase for her, it's fantastic, but there's way more about the movie that is just an absolute treat.
Yes, and luckily I think we'll have another opportunity to talk about it at the end of the year. What, sir, have you been currently consuming?
Well, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I finally got around to a little movie called The Fanatic. This was co-written and directed by Limp Bizkit frontman Fred Durst, starring John Travolta, who's also a producer on the film. This has been making the circles as, absolutely horrendous, offensive, as Scott Wampler over at Birth Movies Death calls it, ill-advised cinema. He has a particular fascination with this late stage era of Travolta where I think our good friend Ryan Covey called him, he's like Nicolas Cage, but bad. Like where he's incredibly committed to these crazy roles, but he's not good. I don't necessarily agree with the quality section of that read, but The Fanatic is a movie. The basic story being that Travolta is playing this character whose name is Moose. We're never given any other name for him other than Moose. He has got some kind of intellectual disability. It's never outright said.
Okay.
I looked up the specific term because I didn't want to say anything that could be.
No, I'm not laughing at your terminology, but like I didn't know that was a thing in the movie.
Oh yeah, well, because people have read it as autism. That is never stated in the movie, but it is very clear that he has some kind of intellectual disability. And I know that Travolta had a son who passed away that was autistic. He has some kind of personal experience with that. Okay, so the basic plot is that Moose is a huge movie nerd, specifically horror movies, and he's trying to get the autograph.
Sorry, that explains a lot. Sorry.
Oh, well,
go ahead.
Well, yeah. Well, you'll see where this is going. So he's trying to get this autograph from a fictional actor, Hunter Dunbar, played by Devon Sawa.
He's still around? My God.
Oh, sure. Devon Sawa's been working. So He's trying to get this autograph. This event happens. He's not able to get it. And he starts crossing boundaries trying to get closer to this Hunter Dunbar character to get an autograph. And this Hunter Dunbar character is a real asshole, keeps blowing him off and threatening him, saying like, keep away from me. Well, then Moose starts crossing more and more boundaries. Like he finds out where his house is and is, standing outside the gates of his house. He jumps the fence and walks into his yard and walks in around his house. Eventually, this escalates to him taking Hunter Dunbar captive in his own house. This is a movie that I totally get it. I mean, it is offensive. It is horrendous. It is ugly. It's really cruel. But man, I can't stop thinking about it. By the end of the movie, I was genuinely affected in such an intense way. And I think that was intentional by the movie, that it refuses to leave my brain. Now, granted, the things that are out there that like, oh yeah, the ironic take of Travolta's putting in a super committed performance to the point of absurdity is absolutely valid. I laughed at that. I sent you a clip from it. You did. And I was pretty delighted by it. It's his performance. Like nobody can say he's being lazy. Like he is committed to this take of the character. That motherfucker burned some calories shooting that scene. Just the movie, the things that happen. Oh my gosh. I've mentioned last year the movie Bayou Caviar. It's not Bayou Caviar. I'm just elucidating to the listener here. Sure. It's caviar from the bayou. From the bayou. And I'm no longer calling, because I used to on the show be like, what were the worst movies I saw? And I'm beyond that. Like, I don't want to give any kind of highlight to a movie I think is the worst. Mm-hmm. I'm now at a point where I'm like, what is the most, what I would call WTF movie I saw? And originally at the beginning of this year, it was the film Serenity with Matthew McConaughey and Anne Hathaway. The Fanatic has easily toppled that. The Fanatic is a movie that absolutely confounds me, mystifies me. I can't believe it exists. It's a movie where I was talking about it with our good friend and GenreVision family member, Danielle Ryan. Hi, Danny. Hey, Danny. We were talking about it, and I sent her a quote from Tarsem Singh about Michael Bay, where he says, you can say Michael Bay's movies are the biggest pieces of shit you've ever seen, or they're incredibly successful and amazing, but the point is you see him. Mm-hmm. For good or ill, I see Fred Durst in The Fanatic. Okay. To a point, I mean, to a literal point where the character Hunter Dunbar is driving in his car with his maybe 10, 11-year-old son or something. And he puts on music and he's like, you want to listen to some Limp Bizkit? Oh man, I used to love these guys back in the day. Yeah. And there's about yikes, really? There is about like a 5 to 10 second scene of them just driving in the car, rocking out to Limp Bizkit. That's almost like that scene in Under the Silver Lake where everybody is watching the director's past movie. I mean, and the movie has something on its mind where it's like, is this a movie about toxic fandom, about parasitic relationships between fans and celebrities? This is a movie that opens with a quote on screen from the fictional character in the movie. Okay, I got to see this. This is Danielle. Nuts. I think advised me against it, but you know what, Danielle? Oh, you'll hate it. Oh, I mean, but that's the thing. I think it's a movie that kind of wants to be hated. It's bizarre. Like, this is not a movie that is trying to be something for everybody. Like, it's ugly. It's misguided. But my God, like, I can't stop thinking about it. And that alone because I put a big thread, basically my review out on Twitter. And one of the things I said is that most movies are disposable for good and or bad reasons. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing is like, that's fine. There can be good movies that you watch and you're like, okay, great. And then a week later, they're gone from your mind. And you're like, oh yeah, I watched that. That was a fine time. But then there's movies like The Fanatic, where I'm just like, what in the name of God?
It builds a little home in your heart.
No, not in my heart. It's like, I feel like
I think it perforated my colon.
Yeah, I think it's like giving me an ulcer. Like, but I think it's a must-see movie for people that I can recommend it to no one. Like, that's
well,
where...
I mean, the good news is, like, when they do your autopsy, they're going to find a pearl inside you. So
that's true. So I don't know if you think you can, the threshold for anybody being able to stomach this movie is going to be so high, but I'm not saying it from a, like, watch it to make fun of it and laugh at it. I think that's the wrong perspective to take with the movie, and that's an easy perspective to take. Mm-hmm. Watch it because there is nothing else I've seen like it so far this year. And as far as Travolta goes, because I've watched some of his late stage movies, I saw Gotti and everybody was going crazy about Gotti. And I didn't think Gotti was anything that great. It was just, yeah, this is a hagiography with Travolta being very committed and bad, prosthetic makeup and shit like that. But The Fanatic is... Yeah, maybe you should watch it, Travis, because you just need to know.
All right.
Like, I think so we'll see. Maybe we'll update you, loyal listeners, on when Travis watches The Fanatic. But let's end things on a much, much more positive note with our
Comment of the Week.
And as always, we want to feature shelf picks, which y'all delivered some great shelf picks for our It Chapter 2 episode. JT Kennel recommended the episode Restless from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is in season 4, which he says is a not so great season, but it's one of the standouts of the season. And I'm actually in the middle of watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I'm in season 4.
Oh, fun.
So that just was perfect timing, JT Kennel. Thank you. So now I have not been enjoying season 4 hardly as much as I did the previous 3 seasons. So now I have an episode to look forward to. Thank you. Mr. Milksteak recommended Godzilla King of the Monsters, oddly enough, which you talked about and you're currently consuming, because he said as a sequel, it kind of mirrored what It Chapter 2 had, where it's kind of bigger and cartoonier and trying to be even more crowd-pleasing than the first one. Mm-hmm. Which I think is a good read about, regardless of our feelings about Godzilla King of the Monsters, I think that is a good comparison. DT Grizzler, and you're going to love this one, Travis, his shelf pick was Drag Me to Hell.
Yeah, and I think he's completely right. I think I even mentioned Drag Me to Hell in the It Chapter 2 episode. So, DT Grizzler, you and I are blood buddies on that one.
Well, and his reasoning was good. He said, which it has a monster with ill-defined powers, a penchant for taunting, weird rituals to fight it, but still manages to have rules that make sense within the movie's universe. It's like, yeah, that's all good points. And then Eric Johnson, who also will feature their comment, had a shelf pick of Killer Clowns from Outer Space, which, hey, there's no reason you shouldn't watch that movie. Killer Clowns from Outer Space, it's so much fun.
I haven't seen it yet, so it's definitely on my to-watch list.
Oh, man, it is perfect drive-in movie fun with a ton of delightful effects work from the Kyotos.
It sounds like it's going to be my Halloween watch this year.
Yeah, that's a good one to put on for Halloween. But also Eric Johnson, commenting about It Chapter 2, said that, I hope the DVD Blu-ray offers a commentary so we can find out what the fuck was with the Juice Newton moment in the movie. That wasn't just out of left field. That came from a subway passing by the stadium and launched from a bazooka. As we discussed in the episode, and I don't think this is a huge spoiler, there is a moment where out of nowhere, Angel in the Morning starts playing for about 3 seconds and then cuts out. And of all the choices made in that movie, that is the one that to me is the most bizarre.
Yeah, it was definitely a blast of weird that I didn't expect from the movie, but it's certainly in line with one creative decision from the first It, just presented in a bit of a different context. It was kind of maybe a key to unlocking the movie's mindset.
That's going to be your Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
For It Chapter 2 is the Angel in the Morning moment.
I think so.
Well, we'll have to see I'm sure It Chapter 2 will be brought up when we do our end of the year roundup in some way. So we'll see. But next week, we're going to be examining fantasy, which I don't think is, as far as like sword and sandals, swords and sorcery type fantasy we haven't done in a while here, with The Beastmaster, one of, I think, the most seen fantasy movies of a particular era.
Didn't it get played on HBO like endlessly for a few years?
Yes, comedian Dennis Miller even had a joke in his routine at one point that HBO stood for, "Hey, Beastmaster's on." So, yes, I certainly have been exposed to it as a kid. This will basically be a first watch for me.
It'll be a first watch for me.
Yeah, but hey, from the director of Phantasm, so that's already got me interested.
Sure.
And slowly but surely, we're making our way through the big fantasy stuff of the 80s as we do this show, which has been a delight. So come back next week and check out our episode on The Beastmaster. And as always, we want to thank you all so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.